The loudspeaker crackled above the Helena livestock auction yard, its static-ridden voice announcing the next lot. The sound was thin, worn from years of use, echoing across wooden beams and corrugated tin. Dust floated in the afternoon light, golden and restless, as if the air itself knew this place thrived on judgment. Men leaned against rails with styrofoam cups of coffee, their hats tilted low against the chill. Women pulled jackets tighter, muttering to one another, while a cluster of teenagers shifted restlessly in the straw. The season was turning late autumn in Montana, with the first bite of winter hiding in the wind. The doors slid open with a metallic groan. From the shadows, a young gray gelding stumbled forward, his legs bent inward like crooked fence posts warped by time. Each step looked less like motion and more like survival. For a suspended second, the yard fell silent. Then the laughter began. "That's no horse," one rancher called out, his voice sharp with amusement. "That's scrap metal with hair." The crowd erupted. A boy whistled as though calling a stray mutt. Another flicked a pebble that skittered by the horse's twisted hooves. The gelding flinched, ears twitching, but he did not fight back. His wide, dim eyes scanned the faces around him and found only mockery. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Hank, shifted uncomfortably behind the podium. His voice, trained to sound cheerful, carried an edge of reluctance. "All right, folks, here we've got a 3-year-old gelding. Obvious deformity, trouble with locomotion. Let's start the bidding at 200. Silence. Not a single hand moved. 100? Hank tried again, forcing the words. Still nothing. Someone muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Wouldn't even make dog food." The crowd roared, cruelty passing from one mouth to another like wildfire. At the very back row, apart from the chatter, a man sat with his cap pulled low. His hands, rough from years of farm work, gripped his knees. Sam Walker, 58, had lived long enough to understand the sound of dismissal. His life had been a string of absences. A boy buried too young, a wife gone because silence had become too heavy. What remained was duty, the farm, the soil, and a home that echoed with nothing but his footsteps. Sam watched the crooked-legged gelding sway under the weight of the crowd's laughter. The world had already stamped the animal useless. But in those broken limbs, Sam saw something familiar, something that mirrored the fractures in himself. Hank sighed into the microphone. $40 just to move him along. Who'll take him? The words barely hung in the air before Sam lifted his hand. Slowly, deliberately, heads turned, whispers sparked like static. He's joking. What a waste of money. Could have bought a second-hand radio. But Sam didn't flinch. He stood, walked forward with the steady gait of a man who had weathered storms far worse than ridicule, and laid 2 crumpled 20s on the rail. "Sold," Hank declared, relief and confusion in equal measure. The gavel struck wood with a dull thud. The laughter swelled again, but this time with disbelief. Sam's shoulders absorbed the noise as he stepped into the corral. The gelding's ears shot back, muscles tense, as if bracing for another blow. Sam didn't reach for the rope. Instead, he crouched slowly, placing the bills on the dirt floor, and left his hand open, palm down. The crowd hushed, puzzled. What kind of man kneeled for a broken horse? For a long moment, no sound passed between them. Only the rough breath of a farmer and the shallow panting of an animal who had never been chosen. Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. "Easy, boy. Come on." He didn't tug. He didn't demand. He rose and began walking toward the exit. The gelding hesitated, knees trembling, then lurched forward. One step, then another. The jeers returned, "Mad old fool." But the horse followed, halting and awkward, unwilling to be left behind. Outside, Sam's battered pickup truck waited, its paint flaking, trailer patched with rusted steel. A man in the crowd shouted after him, "Now you're not just alone, you're crazy too." Sam shut the trailer gate with a clang that rang through the cold air. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and drove off, leaving only dust swirling behind. The laughter faded, swallowed by distance. Inside the cab, Sam's chest ached not from emptiness, but from something restless and alive. He couldn't name it. Compassion, foolishness, hope, it didn't matter. What mattered was the trembling figure in the trailer behind him. Sometimes, the broken were the only ones worth carrying home. The road wound through the Missouri River Valley like a scar across the land. The trailer rattled, its passenger bracing against each jolt. Sam gripped the steering wheel tighter. He had spent a lifetime fixing what others threw away, splintered wood, bent nails, sagging doors. But this was different. This wasn't a thing to be mended. This was a life entrusted to his stubbornness. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon with the dull red of embers fading. As the farm came into view, a weather-beaten house, a tired barn, Fields shorn down to stubble, Sam felt the weight of silence press in. For years, this land had carried only his solitude. Tonight, it carried more. He parked, cut the engine, and stepped out. The air was sharp, smelling of pine smoke from distant chimneys. He opened the trailer gate. The gelding's nostrils flared, breath steaming. Sam didn't yank the rope. He simply stood, giving space. The horse wobbled down the ramp, ears twitching at each creak. Sam whispered a name that had formed silently during the drive. Ash. Gray as cinders, bent but unextinguished. He didn't speak it again, but the word lingered between them like an unspoken vow. Sam led Ash into the barn, where he had cleared a stall. Fresh straw covered the floor. A lantern glowed, soft against beams darkened by time. Ash stood stiff, eyes darting, every sound a threat. Sam set water in one corner, hay in another, and stepped back. Trust would not be forced, it would be grown, like a seed buried in frost. Later, Sam sat on the porch steps with a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The mountains loomed dark, stars pinpricking the sky. He thought of Noah, 9 years old, cheeks round with laughter. A snowmobile accident had stolen him one winter afternoon, and no matter how often Sam replayed it, the outcome never changed. Sarah, his wife, had left soon after, saying silence weighed more than grief. Sam hadn't stopped her. Words were not his gift. But tonight, silence wasn't hollow. It carried the presence of a creature dismissed as worthless, now breathing in his barn. He thought of the men at the auction, their laughter, not even worth a bullet. Waste of money. Their voices still echoed, but softer now, like old ghosts retreating. The wind picked up, brushing against the porch. Sam tightened his coat, staring at the barn's faint light. Ash was alive. Ash was here. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that mattered more than his own comfort. Morning came with frost glazing, the ground silver. Sam rose early, as habit demanded. He boiled water, stacked firewood, then walked to the barn. The gelding stood rigid in the corner, hay untouched, water still. Sam crouched, lowering his palm to the straw. He waited. Minutes dragged. His knees ached, his hand numbed against the cold floor. Finally, Ash lowered his head a fraction, nostrils quivering, but did not retreat. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was the absence of fear. Sometimes absence was the beginning of presence. Sam left quietly, closing the stall door behind him. The sky was brightening over the ridges, light spreading like a promise. On his kitchen table, he opened an old notebook once, filled with Sarah's grocery lists. He wrote a single line in shaky pencil. He came home last night, broken but not gone. The barn stood quiet again. The farm looked the same ash-gray boards, fences leaning tiredly, silence stretching wide. But something had shifted, fragile and invisible, like the first crack of dawn splitting a long night. Sam didn't notice, not yet. The faint shadow at the diner down in town, where a teenager hunched over her phone, replaying a grainy video of the gray horse following the old man out of the auction. The clip had begun to spread, carried by careless laughter. But in Chloe Ramirez's eyes, it stirred something else entirely, curiosity. And curiosity has a way of walking straight to your doorstep. The gravel crunched beneath Sam's boots as dawn spread pale light over the Missouri River Valley. Frost clung stubbornly to the fence rails, tiny shards of glass catching fire under the sun's first rays. His farm sat in quiet defiance against the wide land, wooden siding faded to ash gray, a barn slouched tiredly toward the wind, and fields of corn stubble stretched to the tree line. It was a silence Sam had grown used to, a silence that had sharpened into habit over the years. Yet this morning, the quiet felt altered. A faint presence had moved into it, fragile as a flame. He carried a bucket of warm water to the barn, his breath fogging in the icy air. Inside, the gelding stood where he'd been left, pressed into the corner, muscles taut. His twisted legs trembled under the weight of standing, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Easy, boy," Sam murmured. His voice cracked, foreign even to himself. He set the bucket down carefully so the clang of metal wouldn't startle. The horse didn't move. He only stared, ears flicking at every sound. Sam lowered himself slowly onto the straw, joints protesting, back stiff. He spread his fingers, pressing his hand flat against the floor. No rope, no force, just the steady offer of stillness. The barn creaked in the wind. Dust swirled through the beam of lantern light. Minutes stretched into eternity. Sam's knees ached, his palm chilled against the straw, but he didn't shift. At last, the horse flicked an ear. His nostrils quivered, testing the air. He didn't step forward, but neither did he retreat. It was not trust, not yet, but the absence of fear. And in Sam's quiet calculation, that was enough. He rose, moving with the patience of a man used to long winters, and stepped back. The stall door clicked shut behind him. Out on the porch, with the valley waking to light, Sam opened his notebook and wrote in shaky pencil, "He did not run today." The words steadied something inside him, like a nail driven straight into warped wood. That evening, Sam cooked himself a meal he barely tasted. He sat by the stove, staring at flames while memory gnawed its way in. Noah's laughter, the boy's reckless joy as he raced his snowmobile down a slope slick with ice. The scream of metal and snow, the shattering silence that followed. Sam had told him not to go so fast, but boys don't listen, and fathers can't always hold on. He closed his eyes. For years, the memory had been a weight he bore in silence. Sarah had left soon after, saying grief was easier to carry than the silence he wrapped around them both. And so the house had become what it was now, a vessel of echoes. But there, in the barn, was something different. An animal broken by birth, mocked by strangers, now forced Sam to offer more than silence, to be still, to stay present. On the second night, he carried an apple into the barn. The sweetness filled the air as he cut it, the knife flashing in the lantern glow. He set a slice on the straw, not close, but within reach, and lowered himself again. Ash sniffed the air, ears twitching, eyes dark pools of caution. For long minutes, nothing changed. Then his neck stretched, lips brushing the straw, pausing inches from the apple. He pulled back sharply, sides heaving, but he hadn't fled. Sam didn't sigh, didn't speak. He knew hesitation was the only language the horse trusted. Later, as the lantern flickered low, Sam whispered words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "You'll learn I won't hurt you." His voice cracked on the last word. He wasn't sure if he meant it for the horse or for himself. By the third day, the pattern formed. Sam rose before the sun, carried water, sat in silence by the stall. Each time, Ash's trembling lessened, his ears pinned back for shorter stretches. Once, when Sam shifted his weight, Ash stepped sideways instead of freezing entirely. Small mercies, measured in inches. In the evenings, Sam wrote, he smelled the apple today. He did not bolt. It felt like enough. But outside his land, the world noticed in different ways. At the diner in town, laughter carried as men swapped stories. "Walker's lost it," one said, shaking sugar into weak coffee. "Paid money for a horse that should have been put down." The others chuckled, their voices mingling with clattering plates. A boy at the counter pulled out his phone, showing a blurry video of the auction. Ash stumbling after Sam, halting and pitiful. The men laughed louder, not cruel perhaps, but careless. The video made its way to other screens. Chloe Ramirez watched it on her phone, hunched over homework at the kitchen table. 16, restless with the limits of a small town, she often spent hours at the 4-hour stables, brushing manes, cleaning stalls. Animals made sense to her in ways people never did. She didn't laugh at the video. She replayed the moment where Sam crouched, hand pressed into the dirt, and the horse, awkward, broken, followed him out. Something in that gesture tugged at her. The same reason she sketched horses in the margins of her notebooks. The same reason she felt like an outsider at school. Animals understood silence. The next afternoon, Sam was hammering a loose board onto the barn door when a voice startled him. "Mr. Walker?" He turned, squinting. A girl stood at the gate, dark hair braided down her back, notebook tucked under her arm. "I'm Chloe," she said quickly. "From down the road. I'm with 4 hours. I saw the video. I'd like to help." Sam frowned. He wasn't used to company, least of all from strangers. His instinct was to refuse. He didn't need anyone peering into his failures. But before he could speak, Ash shifted inside the stall, letting out a low, uncertain sound. Chloe's eyes lit with gentleness. "Please," she said softly. "I don't talk much either. I just thought maybe I could sit with him." Sam hesitated, then nodded once. She entered, her boots crunching against the frost, and took a seat outside the stall. She didn't chatter. She didn't reach. She simply folded her hands and waited. Sometimes she opened her notebook and sketched, quick lines capturing the awkward angles of Ash's bent legs. "He's still beautiful," she whispered once, almost to herself. Sam didn't answer, but the words landed deep. It had been years since anyone had called something in his life beautiful. That night, the barn felt less like a place of exile and more like a space of witness. Sam sat by the porch afterward, staring at the dark horizon, coffee cooling in his hands. For the first time, the silence didn't feel entirely his own, but the valley wasn't done testing him. As the week turned, the clatter of tires on frozen gravel announced a visitor. A dusty SUV pulled into the drive. A woman climbed out, adjusting her coat against the wind. "Dr. Whitfield," she introduced herself briskly, holding a worn leather bag. "Town vet." Heard about the horse. Thought I'd take a look. Free of charge. Sam stiffened. He hadn't asked for help. But Karen's manner was professional, unflinching. Inside the stall, Ash eyed her warily. She moved with care, murmuring low as she examined his legs. "The joints are under strain," she said finally, straightening. "But he's not in constant pain. With the right care, he can live years. He'll never be a workhorse, but that's not why you saved him, is it?" Sam shook his head. She nodded once. Approval, understated but clear. "Keep him clean. Don't push him. I'll check back in a week." Her SUV rumbled off, leaving Sam with the echo of her words. But not all eyes were kind. One evening, Frank Doyle leaned against the fence, his limp more pronounced in the cold. A veteran like Sam, but soured by years of bitterness, Frank carried cynicism like armor. "What's the plan, Walker? Turn him into a lawn ornament? Folks already think you're cracked." He spat tobacco juice onto the dirt, smirking. Sam kept hammering a loose rail, the sharp crack of nails punctuating the silence. "Suit yourself," Frank muttered, pushing off the fence. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Sam went to bed that night with the weight of voices pressing in the diner gossip, Frank's sarcasm, the whispers from kids watching shaky clips online. And yet, he remembered Chloe's sketchbook, the way she looked at Ash without pity. He remembered Karen's steady voice. He can live years. Between scorn and sympathy, he realized the horse had already become more than a stall of trembling legs. Ash was a mirror, reflecting how people chose to see brokenness. The barn light glowed faintly across the frosted yard as Sam wrote in his notebook. "The world may call it useless, but I see him standing." What Sam didn't see, not yet, was the sealed envelope sliding into his mailbox the next morning. Thick ink spelled his name. Inside, words weighted accusations written in cold official language. A letter that would bring the county to his door. The envelope had sat all morning on the kitchen table, damp from the snow and heavy with dread. Sam hadn't opened it right away. He'd split wood, carried water, and even mended the chicken coop before finally giving in. The paper inside was short, written in stiff, formal language. "We report an act of animal neglect. A farmer named Samuel Walker is keeping a disabled horse in unsafe conditions, with homemade devices that may cause further injury. Immediate investigation required." The words pressed into his chest like iron. Neglect. The accusation bit deep because it carried echoes of his own guilt, the kind that had haunted him for years. By afternoon, a county patrol truck crunched into his drive. Snow crumbled under its tires, sunlight flashing off the badge on the door. Deputy Ross stepped out, broad-shouldered, his breath fogging in the bitter cold. "Got a call," he said, voice neutral but heavy with official weight. His eyes flicked toward the barn. "Mind if I take a look?" Sam nodded, throat tight. Inside, Ash shifted nervously, ears pinned back. The barn smelled of straw and wood smoke. The lantern glowed soft against rough beams. Ross stepped carefully, scanning the stall. He touched the braces leaning against the wall, running a hand along the smooth wood and patched leather. "You built these yourself?" Sam gave a curt nod. Ross's brow furrowed. "Resourceful," he admitted. "But some folks see this and call it cruelty. They don't see what you see." Before Sam could answer, a breathless voice cut through the cold air. Chloe had pedaled hard through snow, cheeks flushed red, notebook clutched tight. She stood in the doorway, fierce in her smallness. "He's not hurting him," she said quickly, her voice trembling but strong. "He's saving him. Nobody else cared. You should have seen the auction." People laughed. "Mr. Walker bought him when no one else would." Ross studied her a long moment, then exhaled. His sternness softened, though his words stayed official. "I'll file that the animal's alive, sheltered, fed. But you'll need a vet's report, Sam, within a week." And with that, he left, boots crunching against snow. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Sam leaned against the stall door, the letter crumpled in his fist. The old familiar weight of judgment pressed down like the silence after Noah's funeral, like the night Sarah left without a word. For a moment, he considered giving in, removing the braces, letting Ash fade back into the corner, letting the world forget. Then Ash shifted closer, muzzle brushing Sam's sleeve. The touch was light as breath, but it held more than words ever could. Sam froze, then lowered his hand, palm open. The horse didn't flinch. His breath warmed Sam's skin, and for the first time in days, the farmer closed his eyes against the sting of tears. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "They think this is cruelty, but tonight he touched me first. Maybe they can't see it, but I know." The days that followed were taut with unease. Sam worked, splitting logs and hauling hay, but every sound of tires on gravel made his stomach clench. Chloe came daily, sketchbook always in hand. She sat cross-legged on the straw, drawing the curve of Ash's bent legs, the wary softness in his eyes. "He's stronger than they think," she said once, shading the outline of his muzzle. "Sometimes broken things just need longer to stand." Her words hit like a truth Sam had never been able to give himself. Dr. Whitfield returned at week's end, coat dusted with snow, her daughter asleep in the back seat of her SUV. She moved briskly but gently, checking Ash's joints, pressing her fingers along tense tendons. "He's not in constant pain," she confirmed. "His body's adapting, slowly. You've done right by him." She scribbled a note, tore the page free, and pressed it into Sam's calloused hand. "This should keep the county satisfied. Signed and dated. You'll still have to fight whispers, but at least this buys you time." Sam stared at the paper, then at her. "Why help?" His voice rasped from disuse. She shrugged, a small, tired smile ghosting her face. "Because sometimes survival depends on someone showing up, even if it's not perfect." But the valley wasn't finished testing them. One night, the wind came screaming down from the mountains, dragging snow in violent sheets. The barn shook under the force, rafters groaning, lantern swinging wildly on its hook. Ash paced frantically, slipping on straw, eyes rolling white. Sam pushed into the stall, voice low though, nearly swallowed by the storm's roar. "Easy, boy, I'm here." Another gust slammed the door so hard the hinges rattled. Ash bolted sideways, nearly collapsing under his own weight, legs trembling violently. Sam moved closer, steady, until the horse pressed against him, trembling so hard his body shivered beneath coarse hair. Then, astonishingly, Ash lowered his head and pressed his forehead against Sam's chest. The weight was desperate, but it carried something else. Trust. Fragile, but real. Sam's throat tightened. He slid his arm along Ash's neck, holding him steady as another blast roared overhead. "We're not staying here," he muttered. "Roof won't hold." Step by halting step, he led Ash through the storm toward the small lean-to he'd built from Frank Doyle's old lumber. The wind cut like knives, filling Sam's mouth with grit and snow, but Ash leaned into his shoulder, following. Together, they staggered into the shelter. Straw lined the ground, walls low but braced strong. The lantern threw a faint glow as the storm battered outside. Sam sank onto the floor, back against the timber wall, Ash close enough that their breath mingled in the freezing air. For years, Sam had weathered storms alone, storms of grief, storms of silence. Tonight, he wasn't alone. Ash's breath steadied against him, and for the first time in years, Sam felt less like a man bracing for collapse, and more like a man standing with someone who refused to let him fall. When dawn broke, the valley was buried in snowdrifts. Fences bent low, roofs sagged, the land scarred by the Chinook's fury, but the lean-to still stood. Inside, Ash lifted his head, ears forward instead of pinned. His eyes, though rimmed with fatigue, carried calm. Sam whispered, brushing his hand along the gelding's neck. "You made it." Later in his notebook, he wrote, "The storm tested us. He leaned on me, and I leaned back. Maybe that's all trust is standing when the world says scatter." But that fragile trust was about to be tested again. One pale morning in January, a second county truck pulled into the drive. Deputy Ross stepped out, but this time, he wasn't alone. A woman in a heavy wool coat climbed from the cab, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Mr. Walker," Ross said, his voice formal. "This is Miss Dillon, county inspector. She needs another look." She didn't wait for permission. Her boots crunched across the snow as she strode toward the barn. Inside, she crouched, examining the braces, jotting notes with quick strokes of her pen. "Homemade," she murmured, "unapproved. Risk of splintering or constriction." Rising, she fixed Sam with sharp eyes. "Do you have veterinary documentation?" Sam handed her Dr. Whitfield's note. She scanned it, lips tightening. "This buys you time," she admitted, "but make no mistake, without continued oversight, this case remains open." Her words cut sharper than the wind. Chloe burst in then, snow still clinging to her braid. "He's not neglecting him," she cried. "He's the only one who's ever cared. You should have seen the auction. That horse is alive because of him." The barn went silent. Ash lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of her voice. Miss Dillon's pen hovered, then snapped shut against the clipboard. "1 week," she said curtly. "You'll need a full veterinary evaluation, or we remove him." She turned on her heel, leaving cold air in her wake. Ross lingered a moment longer, eyes meeting Sam's. "Do what she asks," he said quietly. "It'll be easier." Then they were gone. Sam stood frozen in the barn's dim light. His hands shook as he reached for the braces. Wood he'd sanded smooth with hope. Neglect. The word echoed louder than the storm winds. Ash watched him steadily, unblinking. For a moment, Sam thought he saw himself reflected back, judged, broken, but still standing. He pressed his forehead against the horse's mane, voice rough. They don't know you. They don't know me either. But we'll show them. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "They gave me a week. I won't let them win. Not this time." The valley slept under a pale sky, but Sam could not. He sat by the lantern's glow, Ash's breathing steady in the stall. Tomorrow, he'd have to fight harder than ever. And then, faint but sharp, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the silence again. A vehicle stopped at the gate, engine idling. Sam rose, heart hammering. No headlights, just a dark shape against the snow. A door slammed. Footsteps crunched. A man's voice, low and unfriendly, cut through the cold. "You should have put that horse down, Walker. You're making the whole town look bad." The voice outside the barn froze Sam in place. Low, sharp, carrying the kind of menace that didn't need shouting. He stepped out into the icy night, lantern light spilling weakly across the yard. A tall man stood by the gate, collar pulled high, hat shadowing his face. Sam recognized the stride, the crooked limp. "Frank Doyle. You're making the whole valley a joke," Frank spat, words steaming in the frigid air. "Every diner in town laughs at you. A broken horse and a broken man, hell of a show." Sam's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Silence was his armor. Frank leaned closer, voice dropping. "County'll take him soon enough. Maybe I should save them the trouble." His hand brushed the fence rail, tapping it like a trigger. The threat lingered, heavy as snow clouds. Sam stepped forward, closing the distance. His voice came low, gravelly. "You touch him, Frank, and I'll forget we ever wore the same uniform." For a moment, only wind moved between them. Frank's smirk faltered, just slightly. Then he turned, boots grinding against snow. "1 week," he muttered. "We'll see who's still standing." The truck engine roared to life, taillights vanishing into the dark. Sam stood in the cold, long after the sound faded. His hands shook, not from fear, but from rage. He returned to the barn. Ash lifted his head, ears twitching. Sam laid a palm against the coarse neck, whispering, "I won't let them." The following days brought no peace. Whispers spread faster than wind. At the diner, voices rose louder when Sam entered. Laughter curdled into cruel curiosity. "Got yourself a circus act, Walker?" One rancher jeered. "Why waste good hay on a beast that can't even walk?" Another added. Sam ignored them, ordered coffee, and sat in silence. But he felt the weight of every stare pressing against his back. Chloe heard the whispers too. At school, classmates mimicked a horse stumbling, braying with laughter. She clenched her jaw, fists tight around her sketchbook. That night, she biked through sleet to the barn, cheeks streaked with angry tears. "They don't get it," she said, dropping onto the straw. "They never do." Sam didn't answer, but he knew the sting of ridicule well. He watched as she sketched Ash again, lines quick but tender. "You can't fight them all," he said quietly. Chloe looked up, eyes flashing. "Then we fight enough, so he isn't alone." Her words cut deeper than mockery ever could. On the third day, Karen Whitfield returned, clipboard in hand, expression tight. "I heard about the inspector," she said. "I'll write the full evaluation. But Sam, you need to understand the town doesn't just question the horse. They question you." Sam bristled. "I don't care what they think." Karen's gaze softened. "Maybe not, but I think you care what he thinks." She nodded toward Ash. "And he needs you steady, not buried under their weight." Sam exhaled, a long breath that fogged the lantern light. She was right, though the truth stung. That weekend, Sam tried the braces again. He tightened the leather straps, speaking low and steady. Ash trembled, but didn't bolt. Step by, halting step, he moved forward. Chloe clapped softly, joy spilling from her in whispers. "He's doing it. He's really doing it." Ash made a shaky circle in the barn, head lifting, breath steady. For one brief moment, he looked almost proud. Sam's chest burned with something he hadn't allowed in years. Pride that wasn't about proving anyone wrong, but about seeing life stand where the world said it couldn't. He wrote that night, "He walked steady today." For a moment, the barn felt lighter than the world outside. But the world outside wasn't silent. Monday morning, another letter arrived. This one bore the county seal. Sam slid it open with calloused fingers. Words leapt off the page. Mandatory hearing regarding alleged neglect. Attendance required. Evidence will be presented. Failure to comply may result in removal of the animal. Sam's vision blurred. They weren't just threatening, they were summoning him. That evening, Chloe found him staring at the letter. She read it, face paling. "They're going to try to take him." Sam's silence was answer enough. Chloe bit her lip, then lifted her chin. "Then we don't let them. The hearing took place 3 days later, in a drafty municipal hall with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The room smelled of dust and old coffee. Folding chairs lined the walls, half filled with curious townsfolk, their whispers crawling like insects. At the front sat Miss Dillon, her clipboard neat, her tone clipped. Deputy Ross stood nearby, arms crossed. Sam entered with shoulders squared but eyes shadowed. Chloe followed, sketchbook tucked under her arm like a shield. Dillon began sharply. "Mr. Walker, records indicate you purchased an animal with severe deformities. Reports allege unsafe conditions, unapproved devices, and lack of professional care. Do you deny this?" Sam's throat tightened. Words never came easy. But before he could stumble, Chloe stepped forward. Her voice shook, but she raised it anyway. He saved him. Everyone else laughed, called him worthless. Mr. Walker was the only one who looked at that horse and saw more. She opened her sketchbook, flipping through pages filled with Ash crooked legs, wary eyes, halting steps. This is what he is now, alive, standing, not neglected, loved. The room fell silent. Even Dillon paused, pen hovering. Karen stepped in then, holding her evaluation. Medical report confirms the animal is cared for, fed, hydrated, sheltered. Braces are unconventional, yes, but effective. There is no evidence of neglect. Ross shifted, eyes flicking toward Sam with something like respect. Dillon's jaw tightened. She stacked her papers, voice flat. Very well. Conditional clearance granted. Random checks will continue. The words were meant to sound like authority, but they landed like relief. Sam exhaled, shoulders dropping. Chloe grinned through tears. For the first time in weeks, hope pressed back against despair. Back at the farm, Sam led Ash into the pale light of dusk. The braces thudded softly as the gelding moved, awkward but determined. Chloe sketched quickly, her breath visible in the cold air. Frank Doyle lingered at the fence, watching. His expression unreadable, he spat tobacco juice into the snow. "You bought yourself a battle, Walker," he muttered. "Valley won't forget." But his voice carried less venom than before. Sam brushed Ash's mane, whispering, "They can forget. We won't." That night, the fire in the stove snapped, sparks rising against the dark. Sam wrote in his notebook, "They tried to take him. They didn't. He stood, and so did I." For the first time, he closed the book with steady hands. The valley slept quiet, but Sam's rest didn't last. Near midnight, Ash's restless whinny jolted him awake. Lantern in hand, he stumbled to the barn. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside, straw scattered wildly, hooves marked the dirt. Ash stood trembling, eyes wide, ears pricked toward the open darkness. Sam's heart hammered. Footprints led away from the barn, fresh, sharp in the frost. Someone had been inside. He gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering in the draft. "Who's out there?" he called into the night. Only silence answered. But the footprints trailed toward the tree line, vanishing into shadow. The footprints led into the trees, swallowed by shadow. Sam stood in the icy yard, lantern shaking in his hand. The storm clouds overhead blocked the moon, leaving only patches of dim starlight. He felt the familiar throb in his chest, the old ache of helplessness that had haunted him since Noah's death. Ash shifted inside the stall, hooves scraping nervously against the straw. His eyes were wide, nostrils flaring at the scent of intruder. Sam closed the barn door, bolting it with a harsh clang. He whispered, more to himself than the horse, "Not tonight. No one's taking you tonight." But the unease lingered like a weight pressing on his lungs. By morning, the valley looked unchanged, snow glittering across fields as if nothing had happened. But the prints still etched the ground by the barn, leading away into the timber line. Chloe arrived early, her braid damp with frost. She stopped short when she saw the disturbed straw inside the barn. "What happened?" Sam told her quietly, showing the tracks. Her face tightened. Someone tried to spook him, or worse. She flipped open her sketchbook and scribbled quickly, capturing the outline of the tracks before wind could erase them. "You should tell Deputy Ross." Sam shook his head. "Ross has his orders. County's already looking for excuses. One word from me, they'll call this proof I can't keep him safe." Chloe stared at him, frustrated. "So, you'll just do nothing?" Sam didn't answer. Instead, he poured fresh water into the bucket, the sound echoing like accusation. That evening, Sam reinforced the barn doors with iron brackets and dragged an old shotgun from the back of his closet. The weapon smelled of oil and disuse. He hadn't touched it since the funeral, when silence had swallowed him whole. He sat on the porch, gun across his lap, lantern burning low. The field stretched empty before him, but every creak of wood or snap of frost made his muscles tighten. At midnight, a distant engine rumbled. A truck crawled slowly down the road, headlights cutting across the snow. It paused at the gate. Sam rose, shotgun cradled steady. The engine idled, then roared away into the dark. The silence that followed was worse than noise. The next day, Chloe confronted him. "You can't sit out here every night waiting to be scared. That's not living." Sam looked at her, weary lines carved deep into his face. "You don't know what happens when you let your guard down." Her voice cracked. "Then teach me, because I'm not leaving him either." The determination in her eyes, so young, yet fierce, pulled something loose in Sam's chest. He didn't want to admit it, but her presence steadied him, the way Ash's breathing had steadied him in the storm. 2 nights later, the threat became real. Sam awoke to Ash's frantic whinny, hooves pounding against wood. He grabbed the lantern and shotgun, stumbling to the barn. The door rattled violently, a shadow tugging at the latch. Sam swung the lantern up, light cutting across the figure, a man in a hood, face hidden, crowbar in hand. "Get off my land!" Sam barked, shotgun raised. The intruder froze, then bolted into the night, snow crunching under his boots. Sam fired a warning shot into the air, the blast echoing across the valley. Ash trembled in the stall, sides heaving. Sam dropped the gun and pressed his forehead against the horse's mane, whispering, "You're safe. You're safe." But his own hands shook so badly he could barely breathe. News traveled fast. By morning, half the diner was buzzing. "Walker's firing shots now," one rancher muttered. "Crazy old vet losing his mind," another said. But not everyone sneered. A few stayed quiet, eyes lowered, as if the story cut closer than they'd admit. Frank Doyle sat alone at the counter, jaw clenched. He said nothing, but when Sam walked in, their eyes met for a long, tense second. Deputy Ross came that afternoon, truck crunching across the frozen gravel. "Heard about last night," he said. Sam stood stiff at the fence. "He came for the horse, crowbar in hand." Ross nodded slowly. "And you scared him off. But Sam, firing shots will only give them more reasons to call you unstable." Sam bristled. "What was I supposed to do? Let him in?" Ross's voice softened. "I know what it's like to stand guard alone, but if you keep carrying this alone, it'll break you." He glanced at Ash. "Or worse, it'll break him." Then Ross handed over a card. "Call me if it happens again. Don't make me hear it from the diner next time." That night, Sam sat in the barn with Chloe, sketching quietly beside him. The lantern light flickered across beams, shadows moving like restless spirits. Chloe broke the silence. "When my dad left, I thought the house would collapse from how quiet it got. But animals, they don't care about your words. Just, if you show up." Sam swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her about Noah, about Sarah, about the silence that had driven them both away. But the words stayed stuck. Instead, he rested his hand on Ash's neck. The gelding leaned into the touch, steady. For the first time, Sam let himself believe they might survive this. But survival wasn't victory. The following week, another letter arrived. This one wasn't from the county. It was handwritten, scrawled in thick ink, "Sell the horse." Or, "Next time, we won't just scare him." Sam read it twice, then set it down slowly on the table. His jaw tightened, breath shallow. Chloe found him staring at it, her face blanching as she read, "They're threatening you." Sam's voice came low, steel hard. "They're threatening him." He folded the letter, slid it into his coat pocket, and stepped outside into the cold. The night fell heavy over the valley. Sam stood at the barn door, shotgun leaning against the frame, eyes on the tree line. Inside, Ash shifted, ears pricked, sensing the unease. Chloe lingered nearby, sketchbook forgotten in her lap. Sam whispered into the cold, as if speaking to ghosts. "They think I'll break again, but I won't." A sudden sound split the silence glass, shattering from the farmhouse window. Chloe gasped. Ash snorted, hooves striking the straw. Sam spun toward the house, lantern swinging wildly. In the darkness, a shadow moved inside his home. The crash of glass jolted Sam like a gunshot. His lantern swung wildly, light carving frantic arcs across the snow. Chloe gasped, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. From the barn, Ash whinnied sharply, hooves pounding against the stall boards. Sam's instincts snapped awake. Years of military drills returned, swift and sharp. He grabbed the shotgun leaning against the barn door. "Stay here," he ordered Chloe, voice firm but low. But no arguments. His eyes locked on hers, steady, unyielding. "If I don't come back in 5 minutes, you ride to the sheriff." Her lips trembled, but she nodded, shrinking back into the shadows. Sam crossed the yard quickly, boots crunching hard against snow. The farmhouse loomed, window on the side shattered, curtain flapping in the cold wind. The lantern light swung from his hand, glinting off shards of glass scattered across the porch. He pushed the door open with the shotgun raised. The hinges groaned. Silence met him, thick and pressing. Inside, the air smelled of cold air and dust. The wood stove still burned low, but the room was disturbed, chairs knocked slightly askew, his notebook open on the table as if rifled through. Sam's voice carried steady but quiet. "Whoever you are, this is your only chance to walk out." No answer. Only the creak of a floorboard deeper inside. Sam moved slowly, lantern held low, shotgun leveled. Each step echoed through the hollow house. He reached the hallway. Shadows stretched long against the walls. Another creak, faint, deliberate, came from Noah's old room. Sam's chest tightened. That door hadn't been opened in years. He pushed it open with the barrel of the gun. The lantern swung light across faded posters, a dusty toy car still perched on the shelf. And in the far corner movement. A man crouched low, face half hidden by a scarf, eyes glinting sharp in the lantern glow. In his hands, Sam's old box of keepsakes, photos, medals, letters. "Put it down," Sam growled, shotgun fixed. The man froze, then straightened slowly. His voice came harsh, mocking. "Didn't think you had the guts to pull that trigger, Walker." Sam's jaw clenched. "Try me." The intruder smirked, dropping the box onto the bed with a thud. "You think this valley doesn't see through you? You and that crippled animal, you're both the same. Weak. Embarrassment to the rest of us." Sam stepped closer, voice like steel. "Say what you want about me, but you stay away from him." The man tilted his head, studying him with cold amusement. "Funny thing is, you care more about that horse than you ever did about your own family." The words cut like glass. Sam's breath faltered, rage rising hot in his throat. "Get out," he growled. The man's smirk widened. "Or what? You'll shoot me and give the county the proof they need to take everything from you." He lunged suddenly, shoulder slamming into Sam. The lantern crashed to the floor, flames sputtering out. Darkness swallowed the room. Sam staggered back, shotgun nearly slipping. The man shoved past him, sprinting down the hall. Sam fired once, the blast deafening, wood splintering inches from the intruder's shoulder. The front door banged open. Boots pounded across the porch. Sam rushed after, heart hammering. By the time he reached the yard, the man was gone, vanishing into the tree line. Only his mocking laugh lingered in the air. Chloe rushed from the barn, face pale. "Sam?" "I'm fine," he rasped, though his hands shook violently around the gun. She looked past him to the house, to the shattered glass and lingering smoke. Was it Frank? Sam shook his head, breath heavy. Too young, too fast. He looked at the trees, fists tightening. But he wasn't here for money, he was here for him. He turned to the barn, to Ash trembling in the stall. Sam pressed his forehead against the gelding's mane, whispering through clenched teeth. "I won't let them take you. Not ever." Morning came bleak and colorless. Frost clung to the broken window, wind whistling through the gap. Sam boarded it with rough planks, his hands moving fast, furious. Chloe swept the glass silently, her face pale but determined. When Karen Whitfield arrived for her routine check, she froze at the sight of the damage. "What happened here?" "Break-in," Sam muttered. She looked at him sharply. "Did you call Ross?" "No." Her jaw tightened. "Sam, you can't keep fighting this alone. Whoever that was, they're not stopping." Sam glanced at Chloe, who hugged her sketchbook close. His voice was gravel. "I can't risk them twisting it against me. You've seen how they talk, how they laugh." Karen exhaled, tired but firm. "Then you need proof, evidence. If you can't trust the valley, you make the truth undeniable." Her words planted something inside him, an idea, raw but burning. That evening, Sam pulled an old camera from a drawer, its casing scratched but still functional. He mounted it above the barn door, angling it toward the yard. Another he strapped inside, pointing at Ash's stall. Chloe watched quietly, then whispered, "So if they come again?" "They won't just find me waiting," Sam said. "They'll find themselves caught." For a few nights, the valley was still. Too still. The only sounds were owls in the timber and Ash shifting against straw. Sam barely slept, shotgun close, eyes fixed on the shadows stretching across the snow. On the fourth night, just past midnight, the camera's faint red light blinked. Sam stirred from his chair on the porch, lantern low. A shape moved at the far edge of the yard, slow, deliberate. Then another. 2 figures this time. Sam rose, shotgun in hand. His voice rang across the cold. "You take one more step, and you'll regret it." The figures froze, then bolted back into the trees, disappearing into dark. Chloe, startled awake in the barn loft, scrambled down. "Sam, was it?" He nodded grimly. "We've got them on tape. The next morning, Sam played back the footage. Grainy, shaky, but clear enough. Two men, faces shadowed, crowbars in hand, circling the barn. Proof. Chloe leaned over his shoulder, eyes wide. You can take this to Ross. They can't ignore it now. Sam stared at the screen, jaw set. But doubt lingered. Would evidence protect Ash, or give the county another excuse to claim he was unstable, reckless, dragging trouble into the valley? He shut the camera down, silence stretching heavy. That night, the valley lay hushed under brittle starlight. Sam sat in the barn, hand resting on Ash's neck. Chloe curled on a blanket nearby. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt safe. Then came the sound tires crunching on gravel. Not fast, not frantic. Slow, deliberate. A truck rolled up the drive, headlights cutting harsh through the dark. It stopped at the gate. The door creaked open. Deputy Ross stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the beams. But he wasn't alone. Another man climbed down from the passenger side, face hidden under a hood. Sam's grip on the shotgun tightened. His stomach dropped. What was Ross doing, bringing him here? The truck idled at the gate, headlights spilling long beams across the snow. Sam stood rigid at the barn door, shotgun clutched in his hands. Inside, Ash shifted nervously, hooves scuffing straw. Chloe peeked from the loft ladder, eyes wide with fear. Deputy Ross climbed out, his breath fogging in the cold. "Evening, Sam," he called, voice low but deliberate. Sam didn't answer. His gaze locked on the second figure, stepping down from the passenger seat. A hood covered the man's head, shadow masking his face. But the way he moved, shoulders hunched, hands fidgeting, spoke of unease rather than dominance. Ross lifted a hand. "Easy. I brought him here because this nonsense can't go on in the dark. He has something to say." The hooded man shifted, finally tugging the fabric back. A young face appeared barely out of his 20s, eyes darting with guilt. Sam's grip on the shotgun tightened. "He broke into my house." The young man flinched, glancing at Ross. Ross spoke carefully. "His name's Tyler." He came forward. "Says he wasn't acting alone." Sam's blood ran hot. "So, you bring him here, to my land?" Ross stepped closer, boots crunching on snow. "Because I need you to hear it straight. No courts, no whispers at the diner. Just the truth." Sam lowered the barrel slightly, but didn't relax. "Talk." Tyler's voice cracked. "It wasn't my idea. They said if I didn't help, they'd come after me too. Said you were making the valley look weak, that the horse was a disgrace." He swallowed hard. "It was Frank Doyle. He's the one. He's been riling people up for weeks." The name struck like a hammer. Sam had suspected, but hearing it aloud dug the nail deeper. Ross nodded grimly. "I warned you Frank was trouble. He's bitter, angry, looking for something to break." Sam's jaw clenched. He already tried. His voice dropped, gravel scraping against steel. And next time, he won't stop at breaking glass. Chloe descended the ladder, fury flashing in her young face. "So he sent other people to do his dirty work? He's a coward." Ross held up a hand. "Enough. Frank's got a record of stirring fights, but nothing that sticks. If I don't have hard proof, it's your word against his. That's why Tyler came." Tyler nodded quickly. "I can tell you where they meet. Out by the quarry shack. They talk there, plan things." Sam studied him, eyes narrowed. "Why should I believe you?" Tyler's shoulders sagged. "Because I don't want blood on my hands. Not yours, not the horses. I was stupid. I thought it was just a scare. But when I saw you raise that gun, I realized." His voice faltered. "I realized this could end worse." The barn fell silent, save for Ash's steady breathing. Finally, Sam lowered the shotgun fully. "If you're lying, boy, I'll know." Tyler nodded, shame thick on his face. Ross stepped forward. "Sam, let me handle this. You keep the horse safe. That's your job. Mine is keeping the valley from tearing itself apart." But Sam shook his head. "No. If Doyle's behind this, he won't stop just because you wag a finger. He respects one thing being stood up to." Ross's jaw tightened. "Don't do something you'll regret." Sam's eyes burned with a fire Chloe hadn't seen before. "I already regret enough." The following day, tension simmered heavy. Word spread fast, as it always did, that Sam had stood down an intruder, that Ross had been seen at his farm with a stranger. The diner buzzed with theories, gossip spilling like cheap coffee. Walker's gonna snap. Doyle won't let this go. Maybe it's time somebody put that horse down for good. Sam ignored the talk, but Chloe heard it at school. Whispers chased her down hallways. She sketched during class, filling pages with Ash's crooked yet defiant stance, as if drawing him kept him safe. That evening, Sam sat in the barn with Karen, who had come to check on Ash. She adjusted the brace straps, murmuring softly to the horse. "He's steadier," she said at last, brushing straw from her coat. but the stress yours and his is visible. If you don't find a way to end this, he'll feel it in his bones. Sam rubbed a hand over his tired face. And if ending it means standing up to Doyle? Karen met his eyes. Then stand, but don't do it alone. Her words lingered after she left, echoing against the barn walls. That night, Sam sat at the table, notebook open, his pencil scratched. They think weakness is a crime. They don't see that standing crooked is still standing. He closed the book, jaw set, decision made. 2 nights later, Sam walked into the diner. The room fell quiet, forks pausing midair, coffee cups hovering. Frank Doyle sat at the counter, back bent, cap low. Sam crossed the floor, boots heavy on the tiles. He stopped beside Frank, voice low but carrying. "We need to talk. Outside." Frank didn't look up. "Ain't got business with you." Sam slammed his hand on the counter. The sound cracked like a whip. The room flinched. "Now," murmurs rippled, curiosity sharp as knives. Frank finally rose, muttering under his breath, and followed him out into the bitter night. The parking lot lay under yellow light, snow piled high at the edges. Their breaths smoked in the cold, tension heavy as the mountains themselves. Sam's voice cut sharp. "You sent boys to my farm, broke my window, threatened my horse." Frank's smirk twisted. "So what if I did? Everyone's thinking it. You and that crippled beast make us all look like fools. Valley don't need your pity show." Sam stepped closer, eyes blazing. "You think broken means worthless, but you're wrong. Broken means survived." Frank's smirk faltered for half a beat, but pride forced it back. "You gonna shoot me for saying the truth?" Sam shook his head slowly. "No, but if you come near him again, the whole valley will see you for what you are. A coward hiding behind whispers and boys too young to fight their own battles." The door opened behind them. Deputy Ross stepped out, arms folded, voice calm but edged. "He's right, Frank. You cross that line again, it won't be whispers, it'll be charges." The silence stretched, only the hum of the diner's neon light cutting through. Finally, Frank spat into the snow. "This ain't over." He shoved past them, limping into the dark. Ross sighed. "You've bought time, but Sam, be ready. Men like him don't quit easy." Sam glanced toward the barn visible down the road, faint light glowing from its loft. His voice was low, steady. "Neither do I." That night, Sam returned to the farm. Chloe sat sketching by lantern light, Ash resting on straw, his breath steady. For a moment, peace settled fragile but real. Sam stroked Ash's mane, whispering, "They'll have to go through me first." Then Chloe looked up, her eyes wide. "Sam, do you hear that?" He froze. From beyond the fields came a sound low, steady, unnatural. Not the wind, not an animal. The distant rumble of engines. More than one. Headlights flickered at the far ridge, moving slowly toward the farm. The headlights crawled down the ridge like a procession of ghosts, their beams cutting through the frost. Engines growled low, steady, like predators circling. Sam stood frozen at the barn door, shotgun clutched, Chloe's breath quickening beside him. Inside, Ash whinnied, hooves clattering against wood, sensing the storm closing in. "Sam," Chloe whispered, "there's more than one." Sam's jaw tightened. "I see it." The trucks rolled into the yard, 3 of them, mud-caked, with men packed in the beds. Shadows jumped down, boots crunching on snow. At their head, limping but grinning, was Frank Doyle. Well, Frank drawled, voice loud in the cold. "Didn't think one crippled horse could stir up so much fuss. But here we are." Sam stepped forward, lantern light painting his lined face. "You come onto my land at night with a mob, that's all the proof anyone needs." Frank chuckled, spitting into the snow. "Proof won't matter when everyone already agrees you've lost it." Walker, the recluse, hiding with his broken animal. "Tonight, we put an end to the circus." Chloe gasped, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. "You can't, he's done nothing wrong." Frank sneered. "Kid, this valley doesn't survive on pity. Weakness spreads like rot, and that horse is rot." Sam raised the shotgun, barrel gleaming in the lantern glow. "Take one more step, Frank, and you'll find out just how steady an old man can be." The crowd muttered, uncertain. Some shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering under Sam's cold resolve. Then came another sound, the crunch of tires. A county truck barreled into the yard, lights flashing. Deputy Ross jumped out, hand on his holster. "Enough!" he barked. "This ends here." The mob froze, caught between anger and authority. Ross's gaze cut to Frank. "You've crossed the line. Intimidation, trespass, attempted harm. I've got Tyler's statement. I've got camera footage. You push one step further, and I'll haul you in front of the judge before sunrise." For a moment, silence ruled. Snow drifted gently, absurdly peaceful against the tension. Frank's smirk wavered, but pride held him rigid. You'd take his side? Over your own people? Ross's jaw clenched. I take the side of the law, and right now, you're on the wrong side of it. The men behind Frank shifted again, muttering. One by one, they backed toward their trucks, mutiny simmering against Frank's command. Finally, Frank spat, his voice low with venom. This ain't over, Walker. One day, you'll slip, and when you do, no lawman will save you. He limped back to his truck. Engines roared, tires spun, and the mob peeled away into the night, leaving only churned snow and bitter silence. In the barn, Ash snorted, still trembling, but calmer under Sam's touch. Chloe exhaled shakily, tears brimming. We won. Sam shook his head. We survived, that's all. Ross stepped close, his voice steady but heavy. This is your chance, Sam. You've got evidence, witnesses, and now the town's eyes. But if you want peace, you'll have to show them what you've shown me, that standing crooked is still standing. Sam looked at Ash, at Chloe's small hands clutching her sketchbook like a shield, at the quiet barn that had become the center of a storm. Slowly, he nodded. Then we show them. The days that followed reshaped the valley. Word spread fast, not of Sam's failure, but of his stand. Tyler testified publicly, shaking but resolute. Karen vouched with her veterinary reports. Chloe brought her drawings, pages upon pages capturing Ash's resilience. And slowly, the whispers shifted. At the diner, laughter dulled, replaced by grudging respect. A few even offered nods when Sam passed, small but significant. Frank kept his distance, bitterness festering, but his grip on the valley loosened. The mob no longer followed his lead. Ash, meanwhile, grew steadier each day. The braces clinked softly as he moved, no longer trembling at every step. One morning, under a pale winter sun, he managed a halting trot across the yard. Chloe clapped, tears spilling freely. Sam stood motionless, throat thick, until pride finally broke through his silence. He's free, he whispered. Crooked, but free. Spring thawed the valley. Snow melted into rushing streams, fields greening under the Sunday Sam repaired fences, patched roofs, and for the first time in years, he felt purpose beyond mere survival. Chloe came daily, still sketching, her drawings capturing not just Ash, but the story of a man and a horse who refused to bow. Karen visited often, her daughter giggling in the straw, reminding Sam of a time when laughter filled his own house. The barn no longer felt like exile. It felt like belonging. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the hills, Chloe handed Sam a framed sketch. Ash stood in profile, legs bent but proud, eyes steady. Beneath it, she had written, "Where dignity stands." Sam's breath caught. He hung it above the stall, words etched into the wood of his soul. "They'll never forget him now," Chloe whispered. Sam rested a hand on her shoulder. "Or you?" For the first time in decades, the silence in his chest loosened. That night, Sam sat on the porch, notebook open. He wrote carefully, the pencil steady. "We stood, against storms, against whispers, against fear. And we'll stand again, no matter how crooked." He closed the book, exhaled, and for the first time since Noah's death, he felt something like peace. Inside the barn, Ash shifted, Chloe humming softly as she cleaned the brushes. The valley seemed still, almost safe. Then Sam noticed it at the far edge of the property, under the fading light. A lone figure stood by the fence, unmoving, watching. Too far to recognize, too still to mistake for chance. Sam's breath tightened, the shotgun leaning close at hand. The figure lingered one heartbeat longer, then stepped back into the trees, vanishing without a sound. Sam's whisper carried into the cold. Was it Frank? Or someone worse?